Thank you very much, Peter. Anyone who's familiar with us will know that we like a good pun, so I've made sure to insert one in the title of the presentation. Following on from Noel, I'm really going to talk about the specifics around offshore in RES. So we don't know an awful lot. We know that the consultants that have been appointed to design the RES, the department, were specifically giving offshore as an element of their scope of work. So I'm going to talk a little bit around some of the specific considerations they should factor in that design, and I will avoid any more references to the proclaimers as I go through my presentation, unless there's an audience demand. We are, Peter mentioned, a consultancy specialising kind of very much in the markets, regulatory and policy space. We have a local team, and we're also part of a wider group with offices in the UK and Australia. We've been doing a lot of consultancy, very much kind of the full value chain, but particularly do a lot of work around kind of assets, routes to market, particularly because it's an area of interest to people, and usually they kind of tend to come to us with slightly interesting problems to solve. And we were voted one of the UK's leading management consultants this year by the FT. This was a bit of a surprise to us. First we heard about it, it was in the FT, so that was a pleasant morning for everyone. So just a little bit of international context on offshore auctions. They've been mentioned a few times. These are just some prices we've been seeing in Europe. 57.50 for Hornsey in the UK, 45 euro in France, 46.60 in Germany. There's been projects that are offered on a subsidy-free basis in the Netherlands. But one of the things that very much is with all these results and the numbers is the devil's very much in the detail when it comes to offshore and offshore auctions. All of these jurisdictions have different mechanisms for paying for the grid and how those costs are allocated. And where those costs sit will drive prices. Someone else already mentioned Taiwan, but we've also seen some offshore auctions in the States as well, bringing a range of numbers from $65 to $98 in Massachusetts and Connecticut, excuse me, New Jersey. Noel talked about the RES structure already, so I won't belabor that point, but very much the idea is it's structured around a contract for difference. So whatever the auction price is, it's referenced against the day-ahead market in SEM, and so essentially it'll be generator pays back when market price is over the reference price, and then generator gets topped up to that reference price. There's a lot of questions about revenue stacking that kind of came up in the IWEA presentation. I won't belabor those points. I'll just talk a little bit more about some more offshore specific considerations. So it's worth thinking a bit about the wider price fundamentals and market context to an offshore auction in Ireland. Starting at number one of the big points is we've already seen in the new market that when the wind blows, the price goes down. If you start connecting multiple gigawatts of offshore wind into that market, the price is going to go down a lot more. That price cannibalization effect is going to happen a lot more as we connect more wind. And so there is a question around what is used to top that up. Because if the PSO continues to be the mechanism by which the generator gets topped up, i.e. the PSO levy comes in and keeps the generator whole up to the strike price, there's a fundamental question then of how that's done and what's the appropriate mechanism for that. And we'll hope that the detailed design contains some thinking around that. There's two sides, moving on kind of around my wheel then, thinking about demand. Big thing about, a number of speakers have mentioned supply chain. Supply chain scale and maturity is a big consideration. Where there's not maturity and where there isn't a lot of scale, there tends to be an element of cost associated with that. And cost is something that has to be factored into bids and affects pricing. The other side of demand then, kind of jumping across the circle for a minute, you think about the actual auction budget. The targets are expressed in terms of overall electricity demand. So they're predicated on assumptions around the future. If those assumptions are right or wrong or they vary, they're very instrumental in setting the budget. So how the budget is set is quite important. I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. Two key areas around networks that are crucial in terms of project bidding into. We don't know how an offshore project is going to access the grid yet. not on an enduring basis anyway. We've seen ECP1, but we don't know what the offshore connection policy is, how offshore projects connect, how the costs of the infrastructure are recovered. The timelines for all that will fundamentally affect how people bid into the auction. And then, as everyone knows, the network we do have is experiencing a lot of constraints. So people are going to have to factor those into their bids, or they're going to have to take views on, is this future network going to have constraints in that? If it is, that's money that's not coming in, so it has to be factored into your bid and may increase the overall pricing. And sorry, just to mention as well, something to think about market as well. If market pricing is more volatile or there is volatility in the market, that's risk. Pricing risk tends to get recovered somewhere, and that's usually cost. And speaking about cost, just thinking about the inputs, these are a range of estimates of different kind of cost elements around CapEx and OpEx for an offshore wind farm. And the numbers, they're based on kind of an estimate of an average across a range of UK numbers. But fundamentally, the point is around the development cost, or a small portion. Turbine tends to be a significant, the turbine and the kind of support structure around the turbine tend to be the most substantial element of the cost in terms of CapEx and construction costs. In the OpEx side, you get a mix of planned costs and unplanned costs, and the green is the unplanned cost element of that OpEx circle there. And you can see that there's a lot of potential unplanned. So if there's a lot of uncertainty in the cost, that's potentially something that's going to have to be factored into the bids for people in the auctions. And that uncertainty is something that we're going to have to think a bit about as we move forward, particularly for the developers who want to achieve certainty when they're putting in a bid, because ultimately that's what they're going to get held to. There's a range of capacity factors here. I'm just putting these in as context for next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about the actual budget. But one part of your bid is the cost. So what are my inputs? The other part of your bid is how much is my project going to produce? This is going to be a product of the capacity factors. And as you can see we've a range here up to the purported ones from Haliad X of the 63%, which would obviously be very contingent on the ground and site-specific factors. But kind of over on the left-hand side, we've estimates, based on actuals from the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult of projects on the east coast and the west coast of the UK. And even there, we're getting high 30s, low 40s. If we replay those kinds of load factors into an auction volume, the colours here represent different portions of the overall budget. So if we assume the 3 terawatt hour budget, and you have a range of capacity factors, about 38%, 52%, one 500 megawatt project, these are back of the envelope, but you very quickly see you get everything from over half of the auction budget to 3/4 of the auction budget being eaten up by one project. Another way to think about this might be if we have a budget line and we have projects bidding in, so the projects bid in and they usually get stacked on the basis of cost. So we have 3 projects in there, they're lower cost. We get an offshore project coming in here, and all of a sudden it's over the budget. So it gets screened out, and we get a slightly higher cost technology come in and taking its place. Now this is all really this really feeds back to some of the points other speakers made about qualification rules, how the price is formed. But ultimately there's a fundamental point that if you are going to get an offshore sector away at scale, you have to design the auction budget accordingly, and it has to be sized accordingly. Sorry, that's a little small for people to see, but it's sort of a kind of indicative timeline for an offshore project, kind of looking from kind of surveys, planning, through procurement, and detailed design into a res process, financial close, followed by pre-construction, and then onshore and offshore works. So end to end, it's about 12 years. We can quibble over the different components of it, but there's kind of 2 points coming out. So if you assume you get an auction towards the end of the res cycle, really to get yourself to an energized project, you're talking potentially 6 years, maybe more, maybe less, but you'd be doing well. And that kind of brings forth a number of points. One is around, firstly, the need, to meet 2030, it does suggest the need for those 2021, 2022, 2023 dates to really be met. Otherwise, you're not going to have projects in the water in time. The other point then, it talks about the preconditions. In order to bid into the auction, you'll need to have done a lot of detailed design work. You're likely to need a lot of your leasing, consenting grid rights in place, or at least close to it. You're going to likely be fairly advanced in a lot of your procurement activities. That points to, I suppose, something that when Ainsley was talking this morning about the kind of slightly end-to-end nature of the proposed consenting process, that could potentially add a little bit of risk to some of these timelines. So there's something there that policymakers probably need to consider. What this also suggests is that fundamentally, even with the fair wind, and the auctions in kind of starting the early 2020s, you still need, there's the question of what gets installed in the interim. So offshore, if offshore is coming along towards the end of the 2020s, then what are the other technologies that are going to come on in the interim and fill that up, and how does that need to be reflected in the overall res design? And I suppose factoring on with that point from urgency, citing the great philosopher Monty Python, there is a need to get on with it. We can't, if the offshore industry is really going to get away and these auctions are going to come through, we really do need to start, we need to make sure that those early timeframes in the climate action plan are respected, and we need to do it across different policy lines, so in terms of consenting policy, grid policy and res as well. And that's been a challenge for the Irish energy sector in the past. We've not always been great in making sure all these different policy processes talk to each other. And when they don't talk to each other, you get misalignments, you get elbows, you get projects spending years and years in planning, years and years then in grid access, planning permissions expiring and things like that. If we are going to do this for an offshore wind sector, we need to get all that together, and we need to do it in kind of a joined up way. Thank you very much.